They used to joke that winter had a personality of its own up north, quiet, stubborn, and not inclined to make your life easy. Anyone who'd spent time in Lapland knew that the cold wasn't just a temperature. It was another presence in the room, judging you, waiting for you to make a mistake. And if you did, it never had to raise its voice. It simply took what it wanted. That was the world the Finnish ski troops grew out of. They weren't built in barracks or lecture halls. They were shaped by long winters, by miles of frozen forests, by the kind of silence you could hear in your teeth. If you ever talk to one of the old veterans, one of the few who's still around, you notice something right away. They describe things simply, like they're talking about fixing a fence, not about slipping through a snowstorm at 40 below with a rifle on their back. There's no swagger, no big speeches or long-winded recollections, just a shrug and a line like, well, we knew the Russians were coming, so we skied out to meet them, as if that were the most normal thing in the world. To understand how these men outmaneuvered entire divisions, you have to picture the land the way they knew it. Not as a postcard scene with neat cabins and tidy drifts, but as a sprawling, skeletal maze. Pine trunks rising like black bars against white ground, lakes frozen into pale mirrors, hills sloping in ways maps never quite captured. Reach the wrong ridge and you'd vanish into a wind so sharp it felt like it was slicing little notches in your face. Reach the right one and you could see 10 miles of wilderness in every direction. And under it all, snow, not one kind, but 5 or 6. Powder that swallowed your skis, crust that snapped underfoot, wind-packed slabs that rang like wood. Those conditions shaped everything. Most armies treat winter like a temporary inconvenience, something to get through, not something to master. The Finns didn't have that luxury. Winter wasn't a season, it was half the year. Kids learned to ski before they could run properly. They learned how snow carried sound, how frostbite didn't always announce itself, how you could read tracks the way other people read handwriting. By the time they were old enough to hold a rifle, skiing wasn't a skill. It was part of how their bodies moved through space. So when war came crashing down over the eastern border, the country didn't need time to invent a winter strategy. It lived in the mountains and the forests and in the muscle memory of the men who'd grown up there. The ski troops weren't some elite, mysterious force cooked up by officers in polished boots. They were farmers, trappers, students, shopkeepers, men who happened to live in a place where moving fast over snow was as natural as breathing. The difference, though, wasn't just that they could ski. Plenty of soldiers could. The key was speed. Raw, improbable speed. If you've ever tried skiing through deep forest, you know how absurd that sounds. Trees don't care about your plans. They leap at you. Branches lash your face like they're personally offended by your presence. But these troops didn't drift through the woods like peaceful skiers out for a morning glide. They tore through it, hard, fast, low to the ground, weaving around trunks like they were born with some extra sense that told them where the gaps were. And they carried everything with them. Rifles, ammunition, field gear, white camouflage suits, sometimes even sleds hauling machine guns. The idea wasn't to sit in neat lines and trade fire in the snow. That would have been suicide. The Soviet forces were huge, vast columns of tanks, trucks, artillery, tens of thousands of men. The Finns couldn't match that. They didn't try. Instead, they became a ghostly presence flickering at the edges of the Soviet advance, a shape that flashed between trees, fired a burst, and disappeared. A group that struck a supply column and then melted into the forest with no tracks visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Their commanders didn't measure success by how much ground they took. They measured it by how much confusion they caused. A Soviet regiment would swear an entire battalion had ambushed them, when in reality maybe 20 men had done the job. Another column would report being surrounded on all sides, but the truth was that small ski squads had split up, attacked from different angles, and regrouped miles away before the Soviets could count their own casualties. And then there was the cold. Armies that don't understand winter tend to think cold affects everyone equally. It doesn't. It hits the unprepared like a hammer. Engines freeze, fuel thickens, bread becomes a kind of icy brick you have to hack apart with a knife. Fingers stop doing what you tell them. A man who hasn't learned to live with cold is a man who loses the ability to fight long before the bullets start flying. The Finnish ski troops weren't comfortable, exactly. Nobody is at 40 below, but they were familiar with what the cold demanded. They managed their sweat, layering and delayering with almost obsessive attention. Sweat was the enemy. Sweat killed more men in winter war than bullets. They insulated their rifles, slept with their boots inside their jackets, kept their skis waxed for the temperature of the hour, not the day. That level of attention didn't just keep them alive, it allowed them to move, really move. And that's where the advantage came from. Picture a Soviet column stretched out along a frozen road, tanks at the front, trucks behind, infantry trudging through snow that reached up to their knees. They moved slowly, breathing hard, struggling with equipment that didn't like the cold any more than they did. Then picture a Finnish ski patrol observing them from the shadows of the trees, close enough to hear officers shouting orders, close enough to smell diesel fumes hanging in the air. They'd wait, patient as stone. When the moment came, they hit like someone snapping a trap shut. Quick strike, fast withdrawal. Before the Soviets could form up and respond, the Finns were already miles away, gliding over the snow in silence broken only by the hiss of skis. All of this added up to something strange. A tiny country with a tiny army forcing a massive power to bleed time, and men in a landscape they never truly understood. And at the center of it all were these ski troops, these fast-moving, pale shadows who seemed to ignore the rules of how armies were supposed to move in winter. What really set those units apart wasn't just mobility or courage. It was the way they thought about the battlefield itself. Most armies see terrain as a background, a thing to move across or take cover behind. The Finns treated it like a partner. Snow, forest, lake ice, darkness, each one had a personality, a mood, a set of habits. And once you learned how those habits worked, you could predict what an enemy column would do before they even knew it themselves. Take lake ice. Any sane person sees a frozen lake in wartime and thinks, don't step on it. Too risky. Too exposed. Now picture a Finnish ski squad at night, crossing a lake at a pace that looks almost unreal, silent except for the faint scrape of their skis. They knew the sound the ice made when it was trustworthy. They knew how to read wind patterns on its surface, how to avoid the thin spots where currents flowed beneath. The ice wasn't a danger. It was a highway, wide and open, allowing them to bypass roads where the Soviets concentrated their forces. They'd vanish into the darkness, cover 10 miles in the time it took a truck engine to warm up, and reappear somewhere their enemy didn't expect them to exist. Same with dense forest. A nightmare for most soldiers. For the Finnish troops, it was a shield, a labyrinth only they understood. Their patrols would wedge themselves between the trees like water slipping through cracks. You couldn't chase them. You couldn't surround them. You couldn't pin them down because they never stayed in one place long enough. And when they chose to stand and fight, they picked locations so unforgiving it felt like the terrain itself was taking swings at the enemy. You hear stories from the old diaries and after-action reports. A platoon burrowed into a thicket so thick you couldn't see 5 feet ahead, cold smoke curling from their rifles. Soviet soldiers stumbling into the brush, confused and half frozen, unable to see who was shooting or from where. And then nothing. Silence. The Finns gone again. Tracks erased with a sweep of a ski, snow falling gently, covering everything as if the fight had never happened. It wasn't magic, it was discipline and training, built on top of a lifetime in that environment. When they weren't fighting, they drilled waxing skis, practicing sharp turns in close spaces, learning to fire accurately after a long sprint, studying how wind shaped snowdrifts. They carried small shovels and could build a firing position or a shelter in a fraction of the time other soldiers needed. They stayed light, they stayed quick, they stayed unpredictable. And the Soviets, for all their numbers, couldn't keep up. Their units were designed for mechanized movement and massed firepower. Neither worked well in forests packed tight as a fist or on roads carved through deep snow. Tanks stalled out, trucks froze to the ground overnight, infantry slogged slowly along the verges, sinking into drifts that swallowed their boots up to the ankle or higher. Commanders issued orders assuming their troops would move at a normal pace, but the cold shaved hours off every stretch of progress. And while those units fought the environment, Finnish ski patrols skimmed over the surface like it was nothing. But the Finns didn't rely purely on hit and run tactics. They had a method to the chaos, a strategy that didn't require huge battles or heavy numbers. They used something they called modi tactics, a word borrowed from firewood, meaning a small stack of logs cut and isolated. That's exactly what they aimed to do. Take a long enemy column and chop it into pieces. Not physically divide them at first, but unsettle them mentally. Hit the rear. Hit the supply trucks. Hit a forward platoon. Leave the middle alone until it didn't know whether it was advancing or retreating. Once confusion took root, the ski troops sealed the fragments off. One cluster of Soviet soldiers would find themselves surrounded by white-clad fighters they could barely see. Another would realize the road behind them had vanished under a line of Finnish marksmen dug into snowbanks. There was no clear front line, no secure direction, just a feeling of being watched from every angle. If you look at maps of the battles from that winter, you see these columns curling like trapped animals, looping back on themselves, trying desperately to form defensive circles in the cold. And all the while, the Finns glided around them in wide arcs, tightening the noose day by day. They didn't attack constantly. They didn't have to. They controlled the space, the pace, the rhythm. They dictated when something happened and when nothing happened. There's a certain kind of pressure that comes from knowing you can't see your enemy, but he can see you, especially as the cold deepens. Frost creeps into the seams of your coat. You can't keep a fire going because the smoke gives away your position. Your breath freezes in your beard. Your hands ache so badly you can barely hold your rifle. And still the pale shapes flicker at the tree line, watching, waiting. Some Soviet memoirs describe the experience as being hunted. Not by monsters, not by demons, by men. But men who seemed fused with the landscape, who moved in a way that didn't feel human because most soldiers simply had no comparison for it. When you're used to marching miles through knee-deep snow, it's hard to grasp what it means for someone else to cover the same distance in a fraction of the time, then fight a battle, then disappear before you can even raise binoculars. The Finnish commanders knew their strength wasn't just in skill or terrain or weather. It was in forcing their enemy into a constant state of uncertainty. Every time a Soviet unit stopped to gather itself, the Finns hit them. Every time a Soviet unit pushed too far ahead, they cut it off. They turned a straightforward invasion into a maze of dead ends and invisible pursuers. And behind the tactics, behind the speed, the precision, was something much simpler. Resolve. A stubbornness as old as the winters themselves. They weren't fighting for empires or ideology. They were fighting for their homes, for the barns they'd mucked out as kids, the frozen lakes they'd skated on, the forests they'd hunted in. Winter wasn't an enemy to them. It was an ally. A rough one, sure, but reliable. The larger forces never really understood that. They treated the cold as a punishment. The Finns treated it as a fact. Ask anyone who spent a real winter in the far north what the cold does to your sense of time, and they'll tell you everything slows down. Days blur together. The light hangs low, almost lazy, barely dragging itself above the horizon before sinking again. But during the war for the ski troops, time didn't slow. It stretched. It thinned out. It became something you had to manage carefully, almost the way you'd manage fuel. Night wasn't a break. It was an opportunity. Moonlit snow can be as bright as weakened daylight, and the Finns used that glow to move faster and farther than their enemies believed possible. Picture a white plain under a silver sky, the temperature's so low the air feels like it's hardened. Then picture a column of ski troops sliding across it in single file, quiet as drifting powder. Their breath coming out in tiny clouds, their rifles carried low, a long snake of motion across an empty world. That's when they were at their best, when everything else seemed asleep. Most armies dread night operations, hard to coordinate, hard to communicate, easy to get lost or fire on the wrong silhouette. But the Finnish patrols spent so much of their lives in dim northern light that darkness didn't faze them. They read shadows the way others read maps. They could distinguish the difference between a snowdrift and a boulder from 100 meters away. They knew which tree lines were good cover and which ones were too sparse to hide in. And since the Soviets rarely moved at night, those hours belonged entirely to the Finns. They would sometimes ski 30, 40 miles before dawn, strike a target, then head another 15 miles to a shelter they'd built previously. Little snow caves reinforced with branches, almost invisible unless you tripped over one. Inside, body heat kept the space surprisingly warm. They'd rest, eat something simple, usually bread so hard you had to soften it in your mouth, and then head out again. That rhythm, move, strike, vanish, became second nature, and yet, for all the speed and adaptability, what kept those units together wasn't tactics, it was camaraderie born from shared hardship. When you operate in temperatures that can kill an unprepared man in minutes, you develop a reliance on others that goes beyond typical soldiering. Everyone watched everyone. You didn't let a man sit too long without checking his fingers for frostbite. You shared warmth when needed. You made sure gear was dry. You kept your squad moving when exhaustion tempted them to sit and rest just for a second, because everyone knew a short rest might turn into a final one if the cold got its grip. Some of the old field journals mention simple rituals. A man would tighten another's scarf. Someone else would knock ice off a comrade's boots. They'd joke quietly to keep spirits up. Not heroic speeches. Little lines about potatoes, hunting dogs, girlfriends back home. Human things. Anchors. Without that, even the strongest fighter could break under the weight of all that white silence. And that silence, there's something about it that makes you hyper aware of your own presence. The crunch of a ski on crust feels like thunder. A distant cough might as well be a gunshot. But that sensitivity turned into a weapon in their hands. They could hear a Soviet column from miles away. Metal tracks clattering, boots shuffling, men talking into scarves. Even the smell of exhaust carried on still air. The Finns could tell the size of a column by how sound bounced off frozen trees, how long the noise lasted, whether the engines idled or revved. By the time the Soviets reached a crossroads or a clearing, Finnish patrols had already mapped every detail in their heads. How many tanks, how many supply trucks, whether they had cavalry, how tired the voices sounded. Armed with that information, they could strike with surgical precision. They didn't waste ammunition on frontal assaults. They hit weak points, the last truck in line, the fuel sled, the communications gear. A small loss could ripple outward, snarling an entire advance. There's an episode recorded in a company log from early January. A Soviet battalion stopped along a narrow forest road after one of its trucks slipped into a ditch. Engines ran hot, steaming in the cold air. Men gathered around the stuck vehicle, shouting advice, hauling ropes. They were tired, annoyed, and in the open. A Finnish ski patrol of maybe 15 men watched from the trees. They waited until the Soviets spread themselves thin, then glided forward in a wide arc. No shouting, no bold charges. Just a few bursts of rifle fire and a single light machine gun sweeping across the road. It lasted less than a minute. When the Finns withdrew, 5 Soviet trucks were abandoned. 2 horses were dead, and the battalion was scrambling in the wrong direction, convinced they were under attack by a much larger force. That kind of thing happened so often it turned into a pattern. Soviet soldiers grew afraid of the woods, afraid of the quiet, afraid of the idea that an entire Finnish company might be just beyond the tree line, watching. They weren't wrong. Often there were eyes on them, but they overestimated the numbers by a huge margin. It's easy to do that when the enemy moves in a way you can't understand. One Soviet officer wrote in his memoir that the Finnish ski troops felt like the forest itself had learned to shoot. He wasn't trying to be poetic, he meant it literally. The men couldn't tell where fire was coming from. They couldn't track the white shapes weaving between the trees. They couldn't chase them. They could barely keep themselves warm enough to keep rifles functioning. Every fight felt like a trap sprung by nature. Back home, the Finnish troops weren't celebrated as heroes in the middle of the war. There wasn't time for that. They were admired, sure, and everyone respected what they were doing, but glorification didn't enter the equation. They didn't fight for fame. They fought because no one else could defend that landscape the way they could. It wasn't bravado. It was responsibility. But in the field, reputation did matter, just in a different way. They relied on trust within their units. You had to believe the man behind you could keep pace in a sprint across a frozen bog. You had to believe he'd check your back when you were scraping ice off your rifle bolt. and you had to believe he'd understand the movement rhythm without shouting commands. Many of their maneuvers happened almost wordlessly. A nod, a hand signal, a shift in posture. They read each other the same way they read the snow. And when you combine that level of cohesion with an environment that favors the light, the quick, and the cold trained, you get something close to unbeatable on its own turf. The irony is that despite all this, despite the feats and the victories, most of them didn't think of themselves as exceptional. They were just men doing what the moment demanded, using the skills their lives had handed them long before the war. Ask one why they were so effective, and he might shrug and say something like, "We knew how to ski. They didn't." As if that explained it all. In a way, it did. If you want to understand how deeply the landscape shaped these troops, you have to look at the places they fought: the narrow forest roads, the frozen lakes, the looping ridges where the wind never seemed to stop. Nothing about those battlefields was flat or straightforward. Every stretch of ground had quirks that only locals fully understood. A lot of visiting officers from other countries didn't get it at first. They looked at a map and saw simple features: a hill, a lake, a road, a cluster of trees. On paper, it all looked manageable. But once you stepped into the real thing, the scale shifted. Hills that looked gentle on a contour map turned out to be jagged ridges lined with boulders. Lakes that seemed like shortcuts were packed with thin ice near the inlets. Forest paths twisted like they had minds of their own. Nothing stayed predictable for more than a few hundred meters. The ski troops didn't just fight in that terrain, they moved with it, almost like they were listening to what the land wanted them to do. If you follow the tracks left in some of the old photographs, you see patterns that look almost like calligraphy. Patrols arced around slopes instead of climbing them. They skimmed the edges of marshes instead of plunging through. They cut long diagonals across frozen plains to stay in the lee of the wind. Every decision saved energy, kept them warm, and preserved momentum. It all added up. And then there was the wind, a biting, a relentless thing that never seemed to slow down. Most soldiers cursed the wind. The Finns used it. They hid their approach inside gusts that masked sound. They waited for snow to blow sideways so their white suits blended perfectly. And if the wind was too fierce for movement, they let it work for them, piling drifts around their defensive positions until the snow itself became a wall. Another thing that surprises people is how organized those units were, despite their loose, almost fluid movements. Outsiders sometimes imagine them as lone wolves darting through the forest, acting on instinct. But they had structure. They had clear chains of command. Patrol leaders were chosen not for rank, but for experience. Men followed the ones who knew the land best, not the ones with the fanciest insignia. Equipment was stripped down to essentials. Each soldier carried a rifle, ammunition, food rations, spare socks, a small stove, and wax for skis. On longer operations, they hauled sleds behind them, loaded with heavier gear: machine guns, mortar rounds, medical kits. It sounds like a burden, but the sleds glided easily across the snow, and a trained soldier could tow one for miles without slowing much. When they needed to cook, they built tiny fires inside holes dug into snowbanks. The flames were nearly invisible from a distance. The smoke filtered through layers of packed snow, rising in faint wisps that looked more like fog than anything else. They melted ice in tin cups and ate in silence, listening for engines or footsteps or the crack of distant gunfire. Every pause carried a kind of alertness. They never fully relaxed. And when they did sleep, which wasn't often, they slept in shifts, curled inside snow shelters or huddled together under fir branches. Body heat was shared. Blankets were scarce. If you woke up cold, you moved. If you woke up sweating, you stripped a layer. Everyone knew the rules. Everyone knew the stakes. One story that circulates among historians is about a patrol that got pinned down by a Soviet unit near a ridgeline. The Finns knew they couldn't win a direct firefight, so the leader, a farmer from a small town whose name most people have forgotten, waited until the wind shifted and kicked up a whiteout. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. You could barely see your own outstretched hand. Most soldiers would have stayed put. He told his men to follow him into the storm. They formed a line, each man gripping the pack of the one ahead like a trail rope. Then they skied straight through the whipping snow, not toward safety, but around the flank of the Soviet line. The Soviets never saw them move. When the storm eased 20 minutes later, the Finns were behind the enemy in a position no one would have thought possible. They attacked quickly, scattered the Soviet unit, grabbed what supplies they could, and vanished into the forest again. When asked later how he navigated in a blizzard, the patrol leader shrugged. "You can tell where north is," he said, "if you know how the wind carries the snow." That was his whole explanation. It's in little details like that where you see what made these units so effective. They didn't rely on equipment or doctrine or massive firepower. They relied on understanding, deep, instinctive understanding of snow, wind, light, and silence. Things most armies treat like obstacles. The Finns treated them like tools. As the winter wore on, Soviet commanders began to shift their tactics, but by then the psychological damage was done. Soldiers reported seeing white ghosts on skis. Some units refused to advance at night. Others insisted on sending out large reconnaissance teams, which only slowed them down more. The Finns, meanwhile, kept moving at their own rhythm, striking where they chose, never where the enemy wanted to meet them. And yet, for all their success, the ski troops never let it turn into arrogance. They knew the dangers too well. They'd lost friends to frostbite, to misjudged ice, to stray rounds fired in panic. Every victory carried the memory of someone who didn't come back. That kept them grounded. It kept them focused. What's remarkable is how they maintained morale under conditions that would have broken most soldiers. They told jokes. They competed to see who could stay upright longest while skiing over rough patches. They carved little figures out of pine when waiting for orders. They brewed weak, smoky coffee in dented pots. They shared letters from home, passing them around, even if no one knew the sender. Those small things mattered. They kept the cold from getting into the mind, not just the body. Years later, when veterans were interviewed, they rarely talked about glory or strategy. They talked about moments, laughing around a hidden fire, singing quietly in a shelter, watching northern lights ripple across the sky while waiting for dawn. They talked about skiing through forests at night and feeling like the whole world had narrowed to the sound of their breath and the whisper of snow under their skis. They remembered the hardship, but they also remembered the strange beauty of it. The way the cold sharpened everything, the way the land seemed to speak if you listened long enough. And beneath all of it, they remembered why they fought. Not because they wanted to be legends, but because their home lay behind them, and they weren't willing to let anyone take it. By the end of that long winter, the ski troops had carved out a place in military history that didn't look much like anything before or after. Plenty of armies had fought in cold climates, but few had ever managed to turn winter itself into a tactical advantage the way these men did. They understood that the cold didn't care who you were. It stripped you down to your basics. If a soldier didn't respect it, if he didn't move with the terrain or manage his body or keep his gear in shape, then the cold would take him out long before any bullet did. The Finns respected the cold. They didn't fear it. That difference mattered. By the time Soviet forces tried to adjust their approach, shorter supply lines, more scouts on skis, heavier winter gear, the Finns had already written the rhythm of the conflict. The Soviets could adapt their tactics, but they couldn't change the land beneath them or the weather above them. They could bring in more men, but they couldn't make those men grow up in northern forests or learn to ski with the speed and control of someone who'd been doing it since childhood. They couldn't teach intuition, the kind that told you when snow was about to collapse or when ice was safe enough to cross. They couldn't replicate the instinctive feel for distance and direction that came from years of navigating wilderness where there were no roads and hardly any landmarks. Even so, the ski troops never mistook the size of the Soviet force. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew they were up against an industrial machine capable of absorbing losses and coming back with replacements. That awareness hung in the air during every operation. They weren't naive about it. Their strategy wasn't built on defeating the enemy outright, but on slowing them, bleeding their momentum, forcing them to grind through a winter that punished them at every turn. There's a scene described in a memoir by a Finnish officer that captures the whole mindset. His patrol had been shadowing a Soviet advance for days. striking supply points and slipping away. At one point, after a successful raid, the patrol paused on a ridgeline to catch their breath. Below them, far off, they could see the glow of Soviet campfires, hundreds of them, scattered across a valley. One of the younger soldiers stared at all those flickering lights and muttered, "There are so many." The officer nodded. "Yes, but they're standing still." That was the difference. The Soviets had numbers, the Finns had motion. And motion in that landscape, in that season, was everything. Observers from other countries, reading reports or traveling to the front and now often struggled to describe what they were seeing. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that small groups of men on skis were holding off or harassing forces 10 or 20 times their size. It didn't match the doctrines taught in academies or the theories written in military journals. But that was exactly why it worked. The ski troops didn't fight according to textbook diagrams. They fought according to the practical logic of survival in the North. Eventually, as the winter began to ease and the daylight stretched a little further each day, the tempo shifted. Snow softened, ice thinned, the terrain grew heavier and slower. But by then, the legend of the ski troops had already spread. Stories traveled quickly, some true, some exaggerated, some shaped by fear. Soviet infantrymen traded rumors about silent patrols appearing from nowhere. Some swore the Finns could ski uphill without tiring, or see in the dark, or move without leaving tracks. Fear fills in the gaps where understanding fails. The truth was simpler and more grounded. These men were experts in a very specific world, and they fought inside that world with total confidence. When the fighting finally slowed and the long winter ended, most of the ski troops returned to the lives they'd left behind. They went back to farms, to workshops, to fishing boats, to small towns where everyone knew everyone. There were no triumphant parades waiting for them, no grand speeches, just quiet pride and the relief of stepping into a warm room where the air didn't sting. Many didn't talk much about what they'd done. It wasn't modesty, exactly. It was just the way people there tended to be, practical, grounded, not inclined to bragging. If someone asked, they might share a short story about a patrol or a close call or a long night in a shelter, but always in the same understated tone. Here's what happened, here's what we did, nothing more. Historians later tried to frame their achievements in big, sweeping terms: courage, ingenuity, resilience. And those words fit, but they don't capture the texture of what actually happened out there. They don't convey the bite of the wind or the eerie stillness before an ambush or the way the northern lights flickered above men who were waiting for a signal to move. They don't explain how a simple skill like skiing, practiced from childhood, could tilt the balance of an entire campaign. If you strip away the romanticism and the myths, you're left with something refreshingly human. These troops were effective, not because they were superhuman, but because they were deeply familiar with the environment they fought in. They used what they knew. They trusted what their lives had taught them. They recognized that the cold wasn't an obstacle to be conquered. It was a reality to be partnered with, and in doing so, they built a style of warfare that larger, louder armies simply couldn't match. Even now, decades later, the story of those ski troops stands out because it shows what happens when preparation meets necessity. When a small group of people uses every ounce of skill, instinct, and grit to defend something that matters to them. Modern militaries study their tactics, draw lessons from them, try to adapt some of the principles for cold weather units. But the full picture can't really be recreated, not without living the winters the way those men did. If you ever travel through the northern forests in winter, you can almost imagine them still out there. The faint hiss of skis on hard snow, the dim silhouettes weaving between the trees, the soft thump of a pole planting somewhere in the distance. Not ghosts, exactly. More like echoes of a time when a handful of determined men used the simplest tools, skis, rifles, familiarity with the land, to hold back a far larger force. Their legacy isn't just in military manuals or in the stories told by veterans. It's in the idea that understanding your environment can be as powerful as any weapon, that agility can defeat size. That knowledge, passed quietly from one generation to the next, can shape the outcome of battles no one saw coming. And maybe most of all, their legacy is in the reminder that sometimes the strongest advantage doesn't come from technology or numbers or firepower. It comes from knowing exactly who you are, where you're standing, and what you're willing to protect. That's what those troops carried with them through the forests and across the frozen lakes. That's what let them move faster, think clearer, survive longer. And that's why, even now, their story still feels like something more than just a footnote in a winter war. It feels like a testament to what people can do when the land they love asks everything of them, and they answer without hesitation.